Participation. Increasingly, we have been paying attention to the concept of participation in various configurations of development programming across the globe. With increasing attention to participation, there has also been increasing scholarly work that talks about participation as a way of democratizing development decision making. In culture-centered work, however, there is an inherent skepticism to concepts of participation tied in with the notion: where does participation originate? Where do calls from participation originate from? And who issues these calls? This skepticism is tied to the basic notion of what the agendas of participation are and toward what goals participation is utilized. Much of our earlier work, namely some of the work that I have co-authored with Dr. Icha Basniat on understanding the language of participation, draws attention to this notion that across various development programs, participation has often been used to co-opt the local capacity of communities. In those instances, the programmers or development planners were not really interested in using participation to really figure out what was going on, but rather the usage of participation was narrowly constricted within developing specific programs and channels to carry out the particular objectives they had within their campaigns and interventions. Let's take an example. Let's think about family planning programs where radio soap operas are used to build then radio listener groups among women. In these instances, when the radio listener groups are built around family planning programs, there are specific agendas to these programs that are configured within these listener groups, where the women are gathered around really to brainstorm and strategize about the best ways to diffuse the family planning agendas within those communities. In our critique, we suggest that in those instances of participatory programming, attention is not paid to the real issues that the women face, understanding the configurations within which the women understand their problems and therefore might figure out what solutions might be effective, but rather, really, in many ways, utilizing the women to carry out specific top-down agendas. In similar ways, then, we have found participatory projects and campaigns being utilized in mining projects, where a multinational comes into an indigenous community, wants to build a multinational mining project, and uses the language of participation, sustainability, to bring in community members to the table simply to figure out the best possible way to exploit them. How then might alternatives to participation be configured? One of the starting points in configuring alternatives to dominant logics of participation is by acknowledging the capacity of participation and participatory processes to fundamentally challenge those structures within which our societies and communities are constituted. In order to do so, participation, if it truly were to be democratic, would have to begin by looking at the ways in which avenues can truly be created for community members to come together, to figure out what are the key problems that they face, to think about what are the kinds of solutions they need for themselves, and then to work with them in solidarity to solve those problems as they see fit. In trying to do that, though, for us researchers, participation means that we let go of the agendas and institutional interests that we go into communities with, but rather start with the entry point of simply wanting to listen to communities in order to build change from the bottom up that is directed toward global structures. Participation in this sense becomes a capacity building tool for engaging with communities through which community voices at the margins can be centered in development policy making, can be centered in campaigns and interventions, can be centered in evaluative processes. What this also essentially means then is that the logic of how we go about setting up our interventions fundamentally be changed, from one where participation simply becomes a tool to one where participation becomes the process through which objectives, strategies, tactics, evaluative processes are determined. In these instances, participation is simply not one small part of the process to be thought about as an element to be utilized to diffuse the intervention, but rather the center, the core element of the process of development planning through which problem configurations and solutions are derived, hopefully directed toward bringing about social change and social justice.